Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 379. This time I'm going to talk about this record, which came out on Milestone Records in 1974, The Elements by Joe Henderson, featuring Alice Coltrane. This is a promo copy, actually, from 1974. A record in general, which was very hard to find. There were a whole bunch of releases in 74, and then nothing after that, really until about 2016-17. And there have been a whole flurry of releases since, lots of discussion online about their provenance, Kevin Gray's involvement, sound quality, etc., etc. I leave those conversations to others, but just suffice it to say, while not exactly cheap, it's no longer as expensive as it was to get your hands on a copy of this. This is a Joe Henderson record, but as Henderson has one of the most diverse tenor sax catalogs in jazz history, that alone doesn't tell you too much. So suffice it to say, this is a spiritual jazz record which is fundamentally different from the kind of music that you might have expected on, for instance, Page One, his debut for Blue Note. Henderson, of course, came to prominence in the 1960s as a hard bop star playing with Horace Silver, but also in his own right. But he also showed in the same decade he was very comfortable playing more out jazz, as he did with Andrew Hill and later on with Freddie Hubbard. Much later in his career, he had a bit of a renaissance, selling a whole bunch of records which were basically anthologies of jazz standards. But this record is from a different era, in between, from the late 60s to the mid-70s, when he's recording for Milestone Records, and his music is infused with quite a lot of black social and political consciousness. His music was also at times highly spiritual in nature, and this record, while still somewhat under the radar, is a classic of the spiritual genre. Joe Henderson was born in Lima, Ohio in April 1937, one of 15 children. His older brother James was a big jazz fan and had a bit of a collection of Norman Grantz's Jazz at the Philharmonic records, records which feature Illinois Jacquet, Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins, Wardell Gray, and Charlie Parker. With his brother's help, when he began to play the saxophone, he transcribed the solos off those records, but it wasn't only jazz he was exposed to. One of his sisters was a big fan of classical music, which made a big imprint on him. And on the radio in Lima, Ohio, what you basically heard was either country music or R&B. Lima was also not too far from the so-called Chitlin circuit, and that exposes Henderson to established R&B stars like B.B. King, Bo Diddley, and James Brown. As he got older in the mid-50s, he'd also go to gigs by star jazz saxmen, people like Gene Ammons and James Moody. He also caught Earl Bostic's band and ends up chatting one evening to the standout saxophone player, the tenor guy, a musician he would later realize was John Coltrane. While he was in high school, he began composing music too. He began writing scores for the school orchestra, and the very first composition he ever wrote, called Recorda-Me, or Remember Me in Portuguese, this was not just some ordinary kid from Lima, Ohio, ends up being cut on his very first album for Blue Note. In his later teens, he begins to travel to Detroit to jam in that vibrant jazz scene they had there in the mid-1950s. He then, after graduation, goes first to what is now Kentucky State University, and then after a year transfers to Wayne State in Detroit. When he was at Wayne State, he studies saxophone, he studies bass, he studies flute, he studies composition, and he was heavily influenced by the great music educator Larry Teal, the author of The Art of Saxophone Playing. Wayne State was an incredibly rich musical environment for Joe. His peers included people like Donald Byrd and Yusuf Lateef. But that rich musical environment was about to take a back seat. He was either drafted and got a deferment in 1955, or he was drafted right after he finished in 1960. But either way, in 1960, he heads off into the Army, where he stays for 2 years. And like most talented jazzmen who ended up getting drafted, he manages to spend much of his time in the Army playing music. That included being selected for a musical tour which took him to Europe, and while he was in Paris, he met Kenny Drew and the great bebop drummer Kenny Clarke. When Henderson was discharged from the Army in 1962, he was 25 years old and he moved straight to New York, where, after a little bit of time, he befriends the saxophone player Junior Cook, who was playing for Horace Silver. And one night at Junior Cook's place, he meets the trumpeter Kenny Dorham, and the three of them, Cook, Henderson, and Dorham, go down to Birdland that night to catch Dexter Gordon. They introduce Joe to Dexter, and Dexter invites Joe to get up on the bandstand in his place and sit in for a few numbers, and the rest is history. By early 1963, he engaged in the first of what would be many, many sideman gigs for Blue Note Records, on records led by Kenny Dorham, that's Uno Mas, and another one by the guitarist Grant Green, Am I Blue? And it might have been then, or it might have been earlier, but clearly he made a sufficient impression on Alfred Lion to become a leader in his own right. From 1963 to 1969, he was on no fewer than 30 Blue Note releases, including 5 as a leader. His debut, Page One, I would call one of the great 1960s Blue Note releases, with its winning combination of hard bop and bossa. He then joins Horace Silver in 1964, not long after those records had come out, when Silver disbanded the Junior Cook version of his quintet. And the first record that Henderson makes with Silver, Song for My Father, is arguably one of the greatest records that Blue Note ever released. What Henderson shows on page one, what he shows on Song for My Father, is flexibility across different musical styles. And that curiosity and flexibility is what comes to mark his career. He is as comfortable playing bop as he is in Latin influenced or avant-garde or spiritual jazz. And he wasn't afraid to push the envelope. In terms of more out jazz, he cut his teeth on some of Andrew Hill's classic Blue Note sides, including Point of Departure and Black Fire. He also worked with Freddie Hubbard in the late 1960s, as well as playing with Pharoah Sanders on Alice Coltrane's spiritual classic, Patah the El Daoud. In 1967, Henderson signs with Orrin Keepnews's Milestone Records, and he produces a series of strong records for them over the next several years, interspersed with a slightly odd interlude in 1971 when he's a member of Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Sadly, there is no audio or video record of those days, but there is at least one photo. After that BST episode, he returns to his solo jazz career, goes out to California, to San Francisco, where Orrin Keepnews and Milestone Records had relocated after being bought out by Fantasy, and it's in California in October of 1973 that he cuts this record. This record is made October 15th, 16th, and 17th, 1973, at the Village Recorder, which is still operating as a recording studio at the corner of Santa Monica Boulevard and Butler, operating out of that same former Masonic Temple building. Orrin Keepnews, who's no longer the label boss but is still the key man for Milestone, is the producer. Joe Henderson plays tenor sax. He also plays two different flutes. Alice Coltrane plays her usual array: piano, harp, tempura, harmonium. Thankfully, not too much of the latter. Blasphemy! Michael White is on violin, which was undergoing a bit of a jazz retro vogue in the early 1970s, and the great Charlie Hayden is on bass. There is also a three-man percussion section. Leon Chankler, I think I'm pronouncing his name right, plays drums on the first and last track. Kenneth Nash plays 6 different instruments on side 2, including bells and gongs. He also recites lyrics on the final track. And Baba Duru Ocean plays either tabla or percussion all the way through the record. One thing to note about this record, somewhat unusually for jazz, because in jazz typically live performances in the studio are prized, but not too unusually for Henderson at this stage in his career, is that there's a degree of overdubbing of his tenor sax, and also more in the vein of studio process sound effects than you might normally expect. Fairly subtle by rock standards, but still a bit startling in the jazz context. The song titles are thematically the traditional elements of fire, air, water, and earth. On side 1, Fire has this up-tempo groove with all this percussion framing Henderson's saxophone, which is quite heavy in the reverb, but also uplifting. Then there's a Michael White violin solo, which candidly you're going to like, or you aren't, followed by Alice's harp and a cool percussion breakdown. The second track on side 1, Air, is a much slower track with Charlie Hayden's bass much more prominent. Joe goes, if not full Pharoah Sanders, then maybe Pharoah Light, with Alice's piano and Charlie's bass swirling around him, followed by something like an Alice-Charlie duet. That side is full of fantastic music, although it has some challenging moments. Side 2 is just glorious. Water is this fine, trippy piece of music underpinned by Alice's tempura, that drone just putting you in that vibe, Nash's congas, and Joe playing some outer space tenor. I love that track. And all of that then blends into another groove called Earth, with Henderson overdubbed and a superb Charlie Hayden bass solo, backed by Alice on tempura. And all that gives way to Joe on flute, Alice on harp, and Kenneth Nash reciting a poem, the words to which are fairly George Harrison. This is truly great, groovy, trippy cosmic jazz, ideal for blazing one up, as the kids say. There's jazz, and there's jazz, and then there's other kinds of jazz. And as I said at the outset, this is a record which bears very little similarity to Henderson's great hard bop records of the 1960s. What it is a tremendous contribution to the late 60s and early 70s spiritual jazz opus of people like Alice Coltrane, Pharoah Sanders, and their peers, amongst whom Joe Henderson is a key figure. Side 2, to me, is an end-to-end masterpiece with a generally mellow vibe punctuated with real energy and real beauty. Side 1, for some, will have some more challenging playing from Henderson and some contributions from Michael White on violin, which I personally find hard work. But those are all relatively minor concerns, and for some people, they'll be features, not bugs. If you're a fan of Alice Coltrane or Pharoah Sanders and their music, then this record, I think, is a must. If you're spiritual jazz curious, then this will be of real interest, and for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.